Yesterday there was a really great session about research in visualization and what people can make out of these. And I'm wondering how much you other than if you've got a grant that's part of what you do, how much you consume or think about or apply research in the work you do. And anybody can answer that question.
Well, I'm holding a mic. So we integrate evaluation into our production of our full-up planetarium shows. It's a process that takes basically 18 months, 2 years. So we've done historically a little bit of formative kind of work, but mostly it's a little bit of like front end, but mostly it's formative in the sense that once we've got the visuals to a point where people can make sense of the story, we actually found it was important to be in the space and you can't really test it on like a iPad. You need to have people see in the environment, experience it. So you have to get the visuals to a point where it's testable, which is a little bit of a challenge because obviously things have gotten to a certain point at that time. And we found that really mostly influences the language that we use to describe what they're seeing. So that we are kind of scaffolding their understanding of what they're seeing by choosing the right words. And so typically what we do is we have people come in, see all of the show or a portion of the show. We have a series of questions around individual scenes, things that we think are potentially problematic. But then we also basically split people off so we then do use an iPad so you can scrub through a video of what you've just seen in the dome. And basically just kind of do a conversation with one researcher, which is often volunteers from the staff, as well as we have one internal researcher. And then just have a conversation, address those questions, and that informs changes that we'll make to the final program. We typically do that 2 or 3 times toward the end of a production.
With Project Harvest, there's so that research project is twofold, right? Environmental monitoring, fate and transport of pollutants in the environment and harvested rainwater, as well as the learning research focusing on self-efficacy for learning and doing science. And so with that branch, there is the pre-assessment materials that each participant takes at the very beginning of the project, in addition to a home description survey. And then they are that measuring tool is bracketed at the end of each year, as well as bracketed when they get their data set. And so right when they get their data at that end of that hour and a half, we hang out for about 20, 30, well, it was on average about 20 minutes, discussing the packet, how it isn't like anything that they're thinking about differently with the data, and also the formative evaluation to create the final visualizations are ongoing up until the data sharing event at the end of each year.
I just wanted to call out one sort of body of research that we try to keep an eye on a regular bit that I haven't heard mentioned a whole lot here is around accessibility. And thinking about that, any data visualizations that we're creating, I was like, Ryan, you called it out around color blindness, accessibility in terms of physical, different abilities, and cognitive load you called out, I think was a really important one. There's a whole body of research around museum physical accessibility and also media accessibility. And I think that's an area where we do try to read some of the research and have that impact some of the data visualizations we create. And Carrie's Science on a Sphere research papers, those evaluation reports are a great body of some interesting insights there.
You mentioned, I think we saw Mayor Lee in one of the pictures coming to the observatory. And I'm really curious about, for all of you really, what kind of programs are being developed specifically for decision makers to increase kind of geospatial literacy, ecological literacy? I mean, given the complexities of a lot of the decisions that they're making, some of the projects that I've done in the past had to do with educating county commissioners in rural North Carolina about what a watershed was. And it was actually very effective in terms of some of the policy. And I was just curious if you could speak to some of that, because I think particularly with the AR sandbox and things like that, it could just be a really great way to sort of enhance their own understanding. And if you could speak to your experiences.
So, is it on? So we actually have regular events that bring agency members that are the decision makers to our facility, because it is both a research facility and an education outreach facility. And so we host workshops. We have an annual State of the Lake report lecture, public lecture, and we do different science conferences, like every second or third year science conference where the different science, science about water quality and forest health and biology are hosted, and that way the scientists can share their information. And so the facility ends up being a place that houses that content sharing.
I'll share a story from a few years ago. Under the Obama administration, the head of NOAA was Kathy Sullivan, and they were in Hawaii at the time, attending a meeting of the Pacific Island nations leaders, and they were visiting the NOAA facility, and a tsunami occurred. And so the warning sirens were going off, and Honolulu wasn't at threat, but they ran down and looked at Science on a Sphere to watch the tsunami unfolding, the model of the tsunami unfolding in real time, and then had a discussion of the placement of buoys and how this type of powerful visualization helps really inform decision making in real time. And so that's an example of, we've used Science on a Sphere in a lot of different ways, but that's just one story of how we were able to use, the timing was just unbelievable. No one was harmed, so, but yeah, we were able to use its real-time capacity to show a tsunami as it was happening.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed that we do a little bit more of is we've certainly gotten them to come to the Exploratorium, quite a lot of policy people. We've done some planning meetings for things coming up by bringing policy people to the Exploratorium. But the one thing I'm finding is our main task is to help them understand how important public education is. I mean, they kind of know about what they need to do, and they have a lot of scientists that help them understand the science, but what they don't seem to understand is how important, funding for public education and events for public education, and how to even really think about that. So soon I think we're going to be a partner to one of the agencies to help them construct an education plan.
And the two things I can highlight, so one thing, I'm part of a National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences Superfund research program, so that's out of the National Institute of Health. And under that program, I lead the Research Translation Corps. And through that mechanism, I'll host multi-organizational calls with all the local, state, and federal government stakeholders, as well as community and academics working at these Superfund sites. And so, granted, there's no I guess the boundary object in those conversations isn't a data viz, or is more about just making contact sheets. Interestingly, that's been very powerful. But regardless, those are platforms to bring people together from government agencies or other stakeholder groups to have discussions about research, cleanup, and communication. And then built into Project Harvest is an internal advisory board where the local water company that provides rebates for rainwater harvesting sits on that board, as well as a nonprofit and an academic as well to inform. And so those are just two mechanisms to increase just awareness and decision making.
Hi, this for Heather and Carrie and probably Brian, but I wanted to thank those of you that are contributing tools back for data interpretation and visualization back to the field. And I wanted to hear a little bit about what does it take to incorporate creating a tool for other people to use as part of your work in creating exhibits and outreach to the public.
Well, it takes commitment to that tool. We launched the Science on a Sphere in about 2003. That was our first installation in a museum. And ever since that moment, we have been committed to providing technical support and training and capacity building for those institutions from that moment forward. And I think without that commitment, we wouldn't have seen the growth, and it wouldn't be the powerful tool that it continues to be.
So the augmented reality sandbox exhibit was born from an idea of how to teach about watersheds. And we had a programmer who does a lot of virtual reality work on the UC Davis campus. And he had some other tasks that he was supposed to be working on, and he just went off for 6 months and wouldn't answer emails and disappeared and came back with a prototype, and we're like, that's it. And there were, minor tweaks that needed to happen, and then the structure. So we, contracted with the Exploratorium to design a hard structure that would be hosted. There's website to put the software, the blueprints, the teaching tools, the instructions, the calibration, and then it just comes down to technical support, which once the project ends is no longer funded. So then that just becomes a labor of love for the programmer and some other people that still supported that had some computer science background. The tricky part is if you don't have the funding to keep it alive or to add the new updates or to get those updates out, whose job is that? That just puts you kind of in a tricky place. But luckily, it has been kind of a maker activity where a lot of the maker fairs and even a Boy Scout, Girl Scout troop can build it themselves. It's just the technical support is tricky.
Well, I'll throw it back to the group and say thank you to some of you in the room who have open sourced some of your tools and built tools that we've been able to use and build upon for other institutions, and not just our institutions, but much smaller ones around the country. I would also put in a plug for anyone who has hiring power in a museum. Hire some technologists at your informal science education institutions. We need more people who can do this kind of work in these spaces. Far too often, we're having to go to outside groups, and there's something wonderful about those partnerships a lot of the times. But I think when we see talks from New York Times or Washington Post, we know that kind of work can only happen where those partners, those technology partners, are in the room with the content experts and the pedagogue, and the people who are thinking about the pedagogy. So it's important to have those people on your staffs too. So I'd love to see more small groups and people just defaulting to doing things in the open source. So yeah.
Thanks, you guys.